Good morning, everyone, and apologies for a short delay. My name is Ella Wazareviv Jakovska. I'm a Roman Catholic laywoman, a biblical scholar affiliated at the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology in Cambridge, and a mother of three children, aged 10, 8, and 6. Apart from my core responsibilities involving family and research, I teach creativity at a medical university. I'm also a godly play storyteller. My husband and I are both Polish and we live in Warsaw, Poland. I'm very grateful to Carrie Pemberton Ford for her invitation to contribute an Advent reflection to the wonderful One Boat Chaplaincy initiative. I have mentioned so many components of my checkered CV because they all contribute to the perspective from which I will be reflecting on the experience of Advent in the pandemic. In the language of godly play, Advent is described as time when we prepare to enter the great mystery of Christmas, and as a journey to Bethlehem, which was not only then, but is also now. Every time I have an opportunity to share the story of Advent with either children or grown-ups, I am amazed by the depth of these simple words. Some years ago, I had a very painful Advent. The experience of a miscarriage with which I entered into the season made me all too aware of its focus on an expectant mother and a soon-to-be-born baby. Then I chose to refocus my gaze on the eschatological perspective and channeled my experience into a cry, Maranatha. I wonder if this cry is audible in our hearts this Advent. A few years later, as a mother of 2 and then 3 young high-need children, I experienced Advent from yet another perspective, informed by a very fresh memory of pregnancy and childbirth and breastfeeding and deep loneliness, known well to the women whose days are spent in often sole company of their wonderful and sometimes intense or demanding children. I decided then to invite other mothers to a collaborative project, a blog version of an Advent calendar consisting of short reflections on daily Mass readings, written by mothers for mothers, illustrated with photographs taken by myself and other contributors. The project ran for 3 consecutive years and is one of my favorite children. I wonder if right now in my community there are any young mothers or indeed fathers who, because of the pandemic, lost access to their support networks and may need to hear from me. There may be little I can offer in terms of practical help due to the circumstances, but perhaps they just need to hear, I see their sleep deprivation, frustration, hard work, and their love. But most of all, this year, as everything or almost everything in our lives and the world itself seems to be turned inside out to reveal our vulnerability, I can't help but focus on God, who chose to become a child and who later put a child in the center, as described in the Gospel of Matthew 18:1-3. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." In Poland, apart from the social, economical, and psychological impact of the pandemic, we are also currently experiencing a deep crisis in the Catholic Church, resulting from many reasons, one of which are the recently revealed cover-ups of clerical sexual abuses. Those affected and traumatized by the abuses, children and young people, were deemed by those who tried to cover up the abuses as having lesser importance and value than the institutional church. Their voices were silenced, and their stories were pushed to the margins. Without ever wishing to deflect attention away from their voices and stories, which rightly came to the center of attention as justice is being sought, I come to realize the many other ways in which children are still one of the marginalized, non-normative groups. And the layers of discrimination, of course, accumulate. In some countries, child labor is still a norm. Children from ethnic minority groups or children with disabilities suffer from greater discrimination. In the current situation of the pandemic, even though most children don't suffer from severe symptoms of the virus infection, they are one of the groups most affected by the pandemic. This includes children refugees in refugee camps, children who are victims of raising domestic violence, children who are isolated from their friends, teachers, and grandparents, children who are processing grief without adequate support, children who have to learn online rather than in direct contact with teachers, which can be particularly difficult for children with learning disabilities or those suffering from digital exclusion. Children whose parents are present and absent at the same time due to work from home situation, etc. Even before the pandemic, many children were struggling under the weight of pressures of the school requirements, their parents' expectations, or abuse and neglect. But this is Advent, and this is the time when we prepare to enter the great mystery of the child who put a child in center. I wonder what this can mean for me today. I wonder what this can mean to us today. One of the authors deeply influenced by Matthew 18 was a Swedish writer, Astrid Lindgren. In her books, non-devotional but deeply shaped by biblical literature, she systematically undermined the normativity of adulthood and championed the reality and value of children's psychological and spiritual world. In one of her stories, she offers a striking retelling of the parable of the feast, set in a Christmas scenery. The book, one of a trilogy of collections of stories about the adventures of a little boy named Emil, is set in the 19th century southern region of Sweden, Småland. Emil, having heard about the injustice and deprivation suffered by the poor people who live in the local poorhouse, uses the opportunity of his parents' absence on the Boxing Day and invites all the inhabitants of the poorhouse to a feast consisting of provisions prepared for wealthy relatives due to visit in a couple of days. There are many textual leads which suggest that this situation is a reenactment of Luke 13:20-14, and even though the source of Emil's idea is not clearly indicated, it may have been alluded to earlier in the story. It is stressed that Emil behaved remarkably well during the Christmas Day service. He sat quiet and still, and his mother even describes him as pious in that day's entry in her special journal dedicated to recording Emil's misadventures. An intelligent, energetic boy like Emil couldn't have just sat there in the church, my suspicion is that he actually listened. In Emil's story, the category of mischief or naughtiness is questioned openly. When Emil shares his plan with his sister and a house help, Ida, his sister, asks him if he wouldn't be getting into mischief. Emil assures her that it is going to be a good deed, and even though admittedly he doubts his father would be very pleased, he thinks that what he plans to do is not being naughty anyway. The narrator in the story informs the readers that when Emil grew up, he became the president of the parish council. It is implied that he retained his disregard for authority and convenance, that he was really deeply impressed by the subversive message he heard in the gospel parable. In this context, let us imagine for a moment that instead being entitled Introduction to Poetry, the following poem, written by Billy Collins, is entitled Introduction to the Bible. I wonder who the implied speaker might be. Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. In light of Collins's poem and Lindgren's Emil, I wonder what the implications of Matthew 18 may be for our relationship with biblical texts. Unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless you change and open yourself to the imagination, the playfulness of children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless you change and open yourselves to the imagination, the playfulness of children, you will never meet God in Scripture. Earlier this semester, I taught a course on creativity and play to a group of over 20 international medical students at the Warsaw Medical University, on Zoom, of course. Studies show that 60% of medical students demonstrate symptoms of burnout. My course included a practical session during which students were invited to explore different artistic techniques. The course and the session seems to have had a clearly transformative effect on them, as students reconnected with the playful, creative parts in their personalities, expressed their stress, worry, sometimes feeling of helplessness through the artistic media of their choosing, and activated the parts of their brains to which they rarely have access in the overwhelmingly digitalized reality. If such a simple exercise had such a transformative effect, I wonder what happens if we, like Lindgren's Emil and Lindgren herself, play with Scripture, explore it with our senses and imagination, experience and experiment, admire, allow ourselves to be horrified by parts of it, inspired by its message. I wonder with which parable I will play this Advent. this Christmas. I wonder how I will do it. I wonder how it will transform me. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to share this reflection with others if you think they might enjoy it or benefit from it. And have a blessed, peaceful, and safe day.